Hello! This is the third episode of Betty Knits. Thank you for joining me again. I'm really excited to be going on this knitting journey with many of you. I would absolutely love it if people could share with me whether or not they're managing to cast on and things, and please send me photos if you do manage to cast on. Because of watching my video, it would be amazing to see that. And if once we kind of get a bit further down the line, I'd love it if you would send me pictures of things that you're knitting and just share with me your knitting journey. I want to teach the world to knit. I think it could be a beautiful thing if we could all knit. Today we're going to go through the two fundamental stitches in knitting, and they are knit and purl. And once you have those two under your belt and you can do them confidently, then you can pretty much do any kind of pattern. So they're not actually as tricky as you think when you get going. Knit in particular is very much just like casting on, but it's just a continuation of that. And purl is almost the reverse of knit, so it's quite easy once you get going with it, and it's just ensuring that you have the wool on the correct side and that you're putting the needle through the wool in the right way. There are different ways that people hold their needles and different styles. I've read that there's like a continental European style and a UK style and a US style, so I guess a bit like all these things, it varies from place to place, and it's very much a personal preference how you decide you want to knit and how you decide you want to hold your needles and hold your wool. Once you've cast on, so I've got 30 stitches on my needle there, you basically just continue to knit in the same way as you were casting on, but instead of pulling each one onto the same needle, you knit it onto the other needle. Let's give it a go. Let's make a start. You put your needle, as you did before, through the loop of the first stitch on your needle. And in this instance, you're knitting like you did with the first technique of casting on, so you're not putting it through the entire stitch, you're just putting it through the front of the first stitch. And then in exactly the same way, you pull your wool around the front of the first needle and pull it down in between the two needles. You then pull that first needle back. At this point, if you were casting on, you of course would pull that loop up over the needle that you have in your left hand. But rather than do that, you keep the loop on the needle in your right hand and you pull it up to the end and pull it off the needle in your other hand. You do exactly the same thing again with the second stitch. Put it off the top of the needle. So you continue to do that all the way along, pulling each of the stitches onto the other needle. So pulling each stitch over and off the end of the needle in your left hand and onto the needle in your right hand. quite fiddly. What you want to make sure that every now and again you pull the stitches to make sure they're still nice and loose on your needle. And I usually, with the fingers of my left hand, I'm kind of using them as a buffer to make sure that when I pull the stitch off, I don't pull a couple more stitches with it, because that's how you drop a stitch, and then those stitches start to unravel. And we will go through how to rectify a dropped stitch a little bit further down the line. There are a few ways to pick that stitch back up and to make it all okay again, so don't worry, but I'm going to do another video on that a little bit later. So at the moment we're just getting each of those stitches off from one needle onto the other needle. And then just make sure that it's nice and loose on that needle, that it hasn't gone too tight. The tightness of your stitches varies depending on how tight you're pulling that piece of wool. Try and keep the tension constant throughout, so you're not pulling it tighter on some stitches than others, and try to keep it so that you can still get that needle through the stitches on the other needle, because if you pull it too tight, then it just becomes impossible to even get that needle through, and then it's really difficult to continue to knit once you're onto the next row. Try and just make sure every now and again that they're nice and loose, and that you can slide them up and down the needle. When you've knit all the way to the end of one row of stitches, you then turn your needle around, so you're holding the needle that was in your right hand in your left hand. You swap them over, and you do exactly the same thing again. You knit another row, doing exactly the same thing, pulling all those stitches from one needle to the other, all the way across. Now, when you use exactly the same stitch for every single row, so it's always the knit stitch for both rows, the knitting that you end up with is called a garter stitch, and that means it looks the same on both sides, so both sides are identical. There's no wrong side or right side, as you get with some patterns in knitting. It just means it's entirely reversible, and they both look exactly the same. They look identical on both sides. When you've knitted all the rows on both sides, and that's called a garter stitch. That's garter. You can also, of course, incorporate purl into your knitting patterns. Purl is very much the reverse of knit. So rather than putting the needle through the front of that stitch, you're putting it underneath, up, and it's in front of the other needle, so it's on your side of the other needle, and you're putting it up through the stitch rather than down through the stitch. And you've still got your wool here, and again you wrap it round. You wrap it from the right round the top needle, so the needle that you will be knitting onto, and down, and you go underneath, pulling up that stitch, and again pull the knitting off the end of the needle, the stitch off the end of the needle onto the other needle. So it's up and under, and it is harder to learn this one. I would concentrate on getting the knit stitch down first before you embark on purl, because it's better to kind of get that in your head, get that muscle memory there, get that rhythm going before you start trying to complicate things with doing another stitch as well. But once you've incorporated purl into your repertoire, you'll be able to do all sorts of different knitting styles and stitches, because knit and purl are basically where it's at. Those are the two that mean that you'll be able to do all kinds of different textures. When you've got knit and purl down, you'll be able to see the different textures that they can produce. One of the very common types of knitted garment that you see around incorporates what's called a stocking stitch. So that means it's different on each side. So the back looks different from the front. There's a wrong side and a right side. And a stocking stitch means this sleeve, for example, is a stocking stitch. It means it's kind of flatter on the front, and you can see each of the stitches. Inside, it looks like the garter stitch. It looks like the knit side. So that looks like the garter stitch, but on the other side, you can see it's a kind of flatter effect. Nice kind of little V-knit V effect, and that's called a stocking stitch. So you have the garter stitch, which is knit on both rows, back and forth, same on both sides, it's entirely reversible. And then you have the stocking stitch, which you do a knit across one side and a purl across the other, and you keep doing that, making sure that you're continuing to purl on the right side and to knit on the right side. I'll show you how to do that as well in a moment, when I've done a little bit more knitting on this. And that means that you get that double-sided, that nice effect. And usually this side would be the outside of the garment and the knit side would be the inside, but not always. And once you have those down, you can start to do some very different effects with it, some different textures. One of my favourites is the moss seed stitch, which we'll do a little bit later in another video, and that's a really nice effect of doing a knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, and then reversing it for the next row, so that you have some little raised stitches and some flatter stitches. It has a really nice textured effect. We'll be doing some of those patterns a little bit further down the line, but for the moment let's concentrate on trying to get the garter stitch and the stocking stitch down. You'll very quickly get to grips with recognising a purl stitch and a knit stitch because they look slightly different on the needle. When you're doing a purl stitch, it's kind of, there's a little sort of raised bit of wool, and when you're doing a knit stitch, it's flatter on the needle. These first two rows were knitted on both sides, and then this third row was purl and then knit, so you can see the difference that that makes. Thank you for watching this video on knit and purl, those two incredibly important stitches. I'd like to know how you get on, so please let me know how you've done with your knit stitch and how you've done with your purl. If you're finding purl stitch difficult, concentrate on the knit first. Try and get that down. Try to do some garter stitch squares, a bit like these ones. These are 30 stitches across, so I cast on 30 stitches and then knit for 30 rows. So they're pretty square. I'm knitting a whole load of them to make a blanket, which I think should be really nice when it's finished, and I'm doing some in different textures as well. Try to cast on 30 stitches and then knit 30 rows back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and then I'll do a casting off video, so you're able to cast off those stitches from the needles and have one of these little squares. So start off with a garter stitch, then maybe try a stocking stitch one if you're able, And so that's doing knit for one row, purl for the next row, knit for the next row, purl for the next row. So thank you again for watching. It's really lovely to be able to share this knitting vlog with you and share this journey with you, and it's been really good fun, and I really appreciate all the feedback. I'd love to hear from other knitters out there and get some knitting inspiration and ideas for future videos. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.